Let's take a look at ensuring fair treatment in employment. Anyone who's suffered unfair treatment at work knows how it's demoralizing. It reduces morale, poisons trust, and negatively impacts employee relations and performance. Employees of abusive supervisors are more likely to quit and report lower job and life satisfaction and higher stress. Even when someone just witnesses abusive supervision, for instance, seeing a coworker abused, it triggers adverse reactions, including unethical behavior. At work, fair treatment reflects concrete actions such as treating employees with respect. Unfairness leads to increased tensions between the employee and their family member or partner. Abusive supervisors undermine their subordinates' effectiveness and may prompt them to act destructively. In terms of employee relations, employees' perceptions of fairness relate positively to employee commitment, job involvement, and satisfaction, and negatively to employees' turnover. The employer and its managers are responsible for ensuring that employees are treated fairly and with respect. Techniques for minimizing unfairness include training managers, ensuring fair pay and performance appraisal systems, and having policies requiring fair treatment. Periodic attitude surveys also reduce unfairness. Some workplace unfairness, such as bullying, is blatant. Bullying and victimization, singling out someone to harass and mistreat, is a serious problem. A survey of 1,000 US employees concluded that about 45% said they'd worked for abusive bosses. Victims will often suffer in silence in fear of retribution. The US government says most would agree that bullying involves three things. People who bully use their power to control or harm, and the people being bullied may have a hard time defending themselves. Actions done by an accident are not bullying. The person bullying has the goal to cause harm. Incidents of bullying happen to the same person over and over by the same person or group, and that bullying can take many forms. Undoubtedly, the perpetrator is to blame for bullying. However, how some people behave does make them more likely victims. These include submissive victims who seem more anxious, cautious, or sensitive, provocative victims who show more aggression, and victims of low self-determination who leave it to others to make decisions for them. Similarly, high performers can earn colleagues' envy and thus suffer victimization. Using team building training, social gatherings, and inter-team competition to build team cohesion can reduce envy and victimization. To help reduce bullying, train employees to recognize bullying and have a code of conduct. Many employers use communications programs to keep employees in the loop. To encourage communication between employees and managers, employers use Open Door, an employee handbook covering employment information, or email and hard copy notes and memos. Two-way communication also helps management. Know what's bothering employees. Soliciting complaints is vital for employers who want to short-circuit inequitable treatment and to maintain positive employee relations. Tactics include hosting employee focus groups or implementing telephone, messaging, or web-based hotlines. Some employers use third-party providers to manage their hotlines. Managers also use open door policies and management by walking around to informally ask employees how things are going. Exit interviews should enable the manager to sample the quality of employee relationships and identify potential problem areas. Similarly, employers use attitude, morale, or climate surveys to support employee relations efforts. One SHRM sample survey has employees use a scale of 1 to very little extent or 5 to very great extent to answer survey questions. Questions include, overall, how satisfied are you with your supervisor? How satisfied are you with your job? Does doing your job well lead to things like recognition and respect from those you work with? Many employers use online or off-the-shelf surveys to measure this type of employee satisfaction. Company-wide employee recognition and award programs improve employee relations. Employers often distribute awards with fanfare at special events such as awards dinners. One SHRM survey found that 76% of organizations surveyed had employee recognition programs and another 5% planned to implement them soon. Recognition and service award programs require planning. It also requires setting a budget, selecting awards, having a procedure for monitoring what awards to provide, and a process for giving those awards as well as measuring program success. Similarly, starting a recognition program requires developing criteria, creating forms and procedures for submitting and reviewing nominations, selecting awards, and having a process for awarding those awards. There are online tools for automating the employee recognition process. Employees use these to recognize each other's contributions, for instance, through peer recognition, spot awards, e-cards, and incentives. Recognition is an important part of improving employee engagement. Employee relations also tend to improve when employees are involved with the organization. A focus group is a small sample of employees who are presented with a specific issue and who interactively express their opinions and attitudes on that issue with the group's facilitator. Many employers use social media to encourage involvement. One survey found that about half of employers use social media to communicate with employees and to develop a sense of community. Employers have long used special teams to encourage employee involvement and boost productivity. Suggestion teams are temporary teams whose members work on a specific analytical assignment, such as how to cut costs. A self-managing or self-directed work team is a small group of carefully selected, trained, and empowered employees who supervise themselves with little or no outside supervision, usually for the purpose of accomplishing a specific mission. Employee suggestion plans can produce significant savings. Societies don't rely just on employers' ethics or sense of fairness. Societies also institute laws and procedures for enforcing those laws. Laws lay out what employers can and cannot do. In so doing, these laws also carve out explicit rights for employees. For example, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act gives employees the right to bring legal charges against an employer who they believe discriminated against them due to race. The Fair Labor Standards Act gives employees the right to a minimum wage and overtime pay. The enforceable rights in employment laws also govern what employers and employees can do. Why do people do bad things? It's complicated. However, one review of over 30 years of ethics research concluded that three factors combine to determine the ethical choices that we make. First, because people bring to their jobs their own ideas of what is morally right and wrong, each person must shoulder much of the credit or blame for their ethical choices. It's not just the person, but the situation that's important. For example, researchers found that smaller ethical dilemmas prompt more bad choices. People seemed more likely to do the wrong thing in less serious situations, in other words. The problem is that one thing leads to another. People start by doing small bad things and then graduate to larger ones. These bad environments in turn encourage unethical choices. There are specific steps managers can take to create more ethical environments. If people did unethical things at work solely for personal gain or because they were bad people, it perhaps would be understandable, although inexcusable. The scary thing is that it's often not personal interests but pressures of the job. One study asked employees to list their reasons for taking unethical actions at work. For most of these employees, meeting schedule pressures or aggressive business objectives ranked among the top responses and personal career interests that last. If your company has a code of ethics, make it clear you take it seriously. If there's no code, show by your own actions and words what's acceptable and not. It's hard to resist even subtle pressure from a boss. In one report, the level of misconduct at work dropped dramatically when employees said their supervisors exhibited ethical behavior. Put another way, managers must not just pay lip service to ethics, but they have to behave ethically. Some managers urge employees to apply a quick ethics test to evaluate whether or not they're about to do what fits the company's code of conduct. People tend to do what they get positive reinforcement for, and gradually stop doing what's not reinforced. Do not inadvertently reinforce unethical behavior or punish ethical behavior. Investigate ethic-related accusations vigorously and make sure you correct the problem. Employers use ethic policies to signal that their organizations are serious about ethics. Managers' statements can reduce unethical behavior on the part of employees, but knowing that behavior is actually monitored and enforced has the biggest impact. One study found that fraud controls, such as hotlines, surprise audits, fraud training for employees, and mandatory vacations can each reduce internal theft by around 50%. Some organizations encourage employees to use hotlines and other means to blow the whistle on the company when they discover fraud. Several U.S. laws, including Dodd-Frank, the False Claims Act, and the U.S. Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act, and the U.S. Federal Sentencing Guidelines, address this whistleblowing. Organizational culture are the values, traditions, and behaviors employees share. A value is a basic belief about what's right or wrong, or about what you should or shouldn't do. Managing people and shaping their behavior depends on shaping the values they use as behavioral guides. The most straightforward way an HR manager can build an ethical organization is to attract and hire ethical people. Also, treat job applicants fairly. If prospective employees perceive that the hiring process does not treat people fairly, they may assume that ethical behavior is not important in the organization. Since 1991, federal guidelines have prescribed reduced penalties for employers accused of misconduct who implement codes of conduct and ethics training. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 makes ethics training even more important. Ethics training involves showing employees how to recognize ethical dilemmas, how to apply code of conduct to resolve problems, and how to use personal activities like discipline in ethical ways. Employees expect employers to punish unethical conduct and to reward ethical conduct. Disciplining employees is often unavoidable, but any discipline should be fair. The manager builds a fair discipline process on 3 pillars: rules and regulations, a system of progressive penalties, and an appeals process. An acceptable disciplinary process begins with a set of clear disciplinary rules and regulations. The rules should cover problems such as theft, destruction of property, drinking on the job, and insubordination. Poor performance is not acceptable. Each employee is expected to perform their work properly and efficiently to meet established standards of quality. Alcohol and drugs do not mix at work. The use of either during working hours and reporting for work under the influence of either are both strictly prohibited. The purpose of these rules is to inform employees ahead of time what is and is not acceptable behavior. Tell employees, preferably in writing, what's not permitted. The employee handbook should contain rules and regulations. A system of progressive penalties is the second pillar of effective discipline. The severity of the penalty usually depends on the offense and the number of times it's occurred, increasing in severity as the number increases. Third, the aim of an appeals process is to ensure that supervisors mete discipline out fairly. Often, employers can mitigate the effects of unfair discipline by catching it during an appeal. However, some supervisory behavior may be impossible to overcome. An error could trigger a costly appeal or even litigation. To help head off these errors, there are guidelines for fair discipline. Make sure the evidence supports the charge of employee wrongdoing. Adequately warn the employee of the disciplinary consequences of their alleged misconduct and have them sign a form. Objectively investigate the matter before disciplining. The investigation should produce substantial evidence of misconduct. The U.S. Constitution contains the Due Process Clause, specifically that no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. Most basically, due process means that anyone accused or suspected deserves to have their case reviewed through a fair process. For example, did the person have a chance to defend themselves? Maintain the employee's right to counsel. For example, all union employees generally have the right to bring a representative to a disciplinary interview. Remember that the burden of proof is on you. In U.S. society, a person is considered innocent until proven guilty. Don't base your decision on hearsay evidence or your general impression of a situation. Traditional discipline processes have two main drawbacks. First, no one likes being punished. Second, punishment tends to gain short-term compliance but have no long-term cooperation. Non-punitive discipline aims to avoid these drawbacks by reducing the punitive nature of discipline. Here are the steps. Issue an oral reminder as a first infraction. Have a private discussion with the employee. Should another incident arise within 6 weeks, issue a formal written reminder and place a copy in the employee's personnel file. Also, hold a second private discussion with the employee. If no further incidents occur in the next year or so, purge the 1-day paid suspension from the person's file. If the behavior is repeated, the next step would be dismissal. Criminal behavior or in-plant fighting, as an example, might be grounds for immediate dismissal. The work of managers influences the employee experience. That experience makes organizations great places to work. Great managers cultivate positive employee relations. After all, employee experience is heavily driven by that of a manager's role.